Picture this scenario. You're sitting at your kitchen table on a Sunday morning, coffee in hand, checking your phone, and you see a notification that $3,000 just hit your bank account. But here's the twist. You didn't work for it. You didn't clock in, deal with demanding clients, or sit through mind-numbing meetings. That money showed up because you own shares in companies that decided to reward their shareholders. Sound too good to be true? Well, what if I told you that replacing a $3,000 monthly paycheck with dividend income isn't some fantasy reserved for trust fund kids or Wall Street legends? It's actually a mathematical equation that anyone can solve with the right knowledge and strategy. My name is Alex, and I spent over a decade in investment banking before walking away from the corporate grind in my mid-30s. These days, I study finance and wealth creation as a passion project, and I help regular people understand how money really works. If you've ever wondered whether it's actually possible to build a portfolio that pays you like a job without the job part, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if it helps clarify how dividend investing really works. Now, before we dive into the mechanics of building a $3,000 monthly dividend stream, let me address the elephant in the room. When most people hear about dividend investing, they immediately think it's either too complicated, requires too much money to start, or takes decades to see meaningful results. And honestly, I understand why people feel that way. The financial industry has done a masterful job of making simple concepts seem impossibly complex, probably because complexity sells expensive products and services. But here's what's fascinating about dividend investing, and this might completely change how you think about building wealth. The strategy isn't complicated at all. In fact, it's so straightforward that once you understand the basic mathematics, you'll wonder why more people aren't doing it. The real barrier isn't knowledge or complexity, it's patience and consistency. Most people want instant gratification, but dividend investing rewards those who can think in years and decades rather than days and weeks. Think about it this way. Every time you buy a share of a dividend-paying company, you're essentially purchasing a tiny piece of a business that generates profits. And when that business makes money, they have a choice. They can reinvest everything back into growth, or they can share some of those profits with the people who own the company. That's you, the shareholder. When they choose to share profits, those payments are called dividends, and they typically arrive in your account every 3 months like clockwork. The beautiful thing about this arrangement is that it's completely passive from your perspective. You don't need to manage the business, deal with employees, worry about inventory, or handle customer complaints. You simply own a piece of profitable companies, and they send you money for that privilege. It's like having a job where you never have to show up, but the paychecks keep arriving anyway. But let's get specific about what it actually takes to generate $3,000 per month in dividend income, because the numbers might surprise you. Most quality dividend-paying stocks yield somewhere between 3% and 6% annually. Let's use 4% as our baseline, which is pretty conservative and achievable with blue-chip companies that have long histories of paying consistent dividends. If you want $3,000 per month, that's $36,000 per year in dividend income. To generate $36,000 annually at a 4% yield, you'd need a portfolio worth $900,000. Now, before you close this video thinking that's an impossible amount, stay with me because there are multiple ways to reach this goal, and some of them might be more achievable than you realize. First, let's talk about the power of dividend growth. Many companies don't just pay dividends, they increase them every year. These are called dividend growth stocks, and they're some of the most powerful wealth-building tools available to individual investors. Companies like Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, and Microsoft have been raising their dividends for decades. When you own shares in companies that consistently grow their dividends, your income stream grows automatically without you having to do anything. Here's where the mathematics get really interesting. Let's say you invest in a company that currently yields 4% but grows its dividend by 5% every year. In year 1, you're getting that 4% yield. But in year 5, assuming the stock price stays relatively stable, you're effectively earning over 5% on your original investment. By year 10, you could be earning nearly 7% annually on the money you invested a decade earlier. This dividend growth effect is incredibly powerful because it means you don't necessarily need to start with $900,000 to eventually generate $3,000 monthly. You could start with a smaller amount and let dividend growth do some of the heavy lifting over time. The companies are essentially giving you raises every year without you having to negotiate or prove your worth. But there's another strategy that can accelerate your progress toward that $3,000 monthly goal, and it's something most people completely overlook. Instead of spending your dividend payments, you can reinvest them to buy more shares of dividend-paying stocks. This creates a compound effect where your dividends generate more dividends, which generate even more dividends. This reinvestment strategy is like a snowball rolling down a hill. It starts small, but as it picks up speed and size, it becomes an unstoppable force. Every dividend payment you receive and reinvest purchases more shares, which entitles you to larger dividend payments in the future, which you can reinvest to buy even more shares. The cycle continues and your income stream grows exponentially rather than linearly. Let's look at a practical example. Suppose you start with $50,000 invested in dividend stocks yielding 4%. That generates $2,000 in annual dividends, or about $167 per month. Not exactly replacement income territory, but it's a start. Now, instead of spending that $167, you reinvest it every month to buy more dividend-paying shares. Assuming you can find stocks that grow their dividends by an average of 5% per year, and you consistently reinvest all your dividend payments, your monthly dividend income could grow to over $500 within 5 years. That's triple your starting income, achieved through nothing more than patience and reinvestment. By year 10, you could be looking at over $1,000 per month, and by year 15, you might actually hit that $3,000 monthly target. The key insight here is that dividend investing isn't just about the initial yield you receive. It's about creating a system where your money works harder and harder for you over time. The companies you own are growing their profits and sharing more of those profits with you each year. Meanwhile, you're using those payments to acquire more ownership in profitable businesses, which entitles you to even larger payments in the future. Now, you might be wondering which specific stocks or sectors offer the best dividend opportunities. And that's where things get really interesting because the landscape of dividend investing has evolved dramatically over the past few decades. Traditional dividend sectors like utilities, telecommunications, and consumer staples are still important, but technology companies have become major dividend players in recent years. Companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Broadcom now pay substantial dividends while still growing rapidly. This combination of growth and income is incredibly powerful because you get the best of both worlds. Your shares can appreciate in value while simultaneously generating increasing dividend payments. But here's something most people don't consider when they're evaluating dividend stocks. The sustainability of the dividend is far more important than the current yield. A company paying an 8% dividend might seem attractive, but if that payment isn't sustainable based on their earnings and cash flow, you could be setting yourself up for disappointment. This is where most dividend investors make their biggest mistake. They chase yield without understanding the business fundamentals behind those payments. I've seen people get absolutely burned by this approach, loading up on stocks that yield 7%, 8%, even 10%, only to watch those companies cut their dividends in half when economic conditions change. Think about it this way. If a company is paying out more money than it's actually earning, that's not sustainable. It's like someone who makes $50,000 per year trying to maintain an $80,000 lifestyle. Eventually, something has to give. The same principle applies to dividend payments. Companies that pay out too much of their earnings as dividends are essentially borrowing from their future to pay shareholders today. This is why dividend coverage ratio becomes crucial when you're building a portfolio designed to replace your paycheck. You want companies that earn significantly more than they pay out in dividends, leaving room for both business reinvestment and dividend growth. A healthy dividend coverage ratio is typically around 2 to 1, meaning the company earns twice what it pays in dividends. But here's where the analysis gets more nuanced. And this is something they definitely don't teach you in those basic investing courses. Cash flow matters more than reported earnings when evaluating dividend sustainability. A company might show strong profits on paper due to accounting methods, but if they're not generating actual cash, those dividend payments become questionable. I learned this lesson the hard way early in my career. There was this telecommunications company that looked fantastic on paper. Great dividend yield, consistent earnings growth, everything you'd want to see. But when I dug deeper into their cash flow statements, I discovered they were essentially funding their dividend payments with debt. They were borrowing money to pay shareholders, which is like using a credit card to pay your mortgage. Sure enough, within 2 years, they slashed their dividend by 60%, and the stock price collapsed. Investors who had bought the stock for its 7% yield suddenly found themselves with a 2.8% yield and massive capital losses. It was an expensive reminder that sustainable dividends come from sustainable business models, not accounting tricks. This brings us to something I call the dividend quality pyramid. At the base, you have companies with rock-solid business models that generate consistent cash flows regardless of economic conditions. These are businesses that provide essential products or services that people need, whether times are good or bad. Think utilities, consumer staples, healthcare companies that make life-saving medications. Moving up the pyramid, you have companies with strong competitive advantages but slightly more cyclical business models. These might include technology companies with dominant market positions, financial services firms with diversified revenue streams, or industrial companies with long-term contracts. At the top of the pyramid, you have higher-yielding companies that might be temporarily out of favor, or operating in challenging industries. These can offer attractive yields, but they require much more careful analysis and shouldn't represent the core of your dividend portfolio. The key to building a $3,000 monthly dividend stream is constructing a portfolio that draws from all levels of this pyramid, but weights most heavily toward the base. You want the majority of your dividend income coming from companies that could keep paying you even if the economy hits rough patches. Now let's talk about something that could dramatically accelerate your path to $3,000 monthly. Tax-advantaged accounts like 401ks, IRAs, and Roth IRAs can be incredibly powerful tools for dividend investors. When you hold dividend-paying stocks in these accounts, you're not paying taxes on those dividend payments each year, which means more money stays invested and compounds over time. Here's a practical example that might blow your mind. Let's say you're in a 25% tax bracket and you receive $1,000 in dividend payments in a regular taxable account. After taxes, you only have $750 to reinvest. But if those same dividends are generated inside a Roth IRA, you keep the full $1,000 to reinvest, plus all future growth is tax-free when you withdraw it in retirement. Over decades, this tax advantage compounds into massive differences in wealth accumulation. The person using tax-advantaged accounts effectively gets a 25% head start on building their dividend income stream. This is why maximizing contributions to 401ks and IRAs should be your first priority before building dividend portfolios in taxable accounts. But there's a strategy that most people completely overlook that could help you reach $3,000 monthly much faster than traditional dividend investing alone. It's called the barbell approach, and it involves combining high-quality dividend growth stocks with real estate investment trusts, or REITs. REITs are companies that own and operate income-producing real estate. By law, they're required to distribute at least 90% of their taxable income to shareholders as dividends. This creates a unique situation where you can often find REITs yielding 6%, 7%, even 8% from legitimate profitable businesses. The beauty of adding REITs to your dividend portfolio is diversification across asset classes. While your dividend growth stocks give you exposure to corporate profits and economic growth, REITs give you exposure to real estate values and rental income streams. When one asset class struggles, the other might thrive, smoothing out your overall returns. Here's how the barbell approach might work in practice. Maybe 70% of your dividend portfolio consists of high-quality dividend growth stocks from companies like Microsoft, Johnson & Johnson, and Procter & Gamble. These provide stability and consistent dividend growth over time. The remaining 30% goes into carefully selected REITs that offer higher current yields but potentially slower dividend growth. This combination could potentially generate a blended yield of 5% to 6%. Right from the start, meaning you'd need roughly $600,000 to $720,000 to generate $3,000 monthly instead of the $900,000 we calculated earlier using a 4% yield assumption. That's a significant difference that could shorten your timeline by several years. There's another angle to consider that most dividend investors never think about. International dividend stocks can offer opportunities that simply don't exist in the U.S. market. Some foreign companies pay dividends twice per year instead of quarterly, and certain countries have tax treaties that can reduce withholding taxes on foreign dividends. European utilities, Canadian banks, and Australian mining companies often offer attractive dividend yields with different risk profiles than their American counterparts. Adding international exposure to your dividend portfolio provides geographic diversification and access to dividend opportunities in different economic cycles. The psychological aspect of dividend investing is something I find absolutely fascinating, and it's probably the most important factor in determining whether someone will successfully build that $3,000 monthly income stream. Unlike growth investing, where you might not see tangible results for years, dividend investing provides regular feedback in the form of quarterly payments. This regular reinforcement helps maintain discipline during market downturns when stock prices are volatile, but dividend payments continue arriving. There's something incredibly powerful about watching your dividend income grow steadily even when your portfolio value fluctuates with market sentiment. When I first started receiving dividend payments in my 20s, I remember the excitement of seeing that first $47 deposit hit my account. It wasn't life-changing money, but something clicked in my brain that day. This wasn't earned income that required my time and energy. This was my money working for me while I was sleeping, traveling, or doing literally anything else with my life. That psychological shift is what separates successful dividend investors from those who give up after a few years. When you start seeing those payments as evidence that your strategy is working, it becomes much easier to stay committed during the inevitable market turbulence. Stock prices will fluctuate, sometimes dramatically, but those dividend deposits keep showing up with remarkable consistency. I've mentored hundreds of people over the years, and the ones who successfully build substantial dividend income streams all share this common trait. They fall in love with the process of accumulating shares rather than obsessing over daily stock price movements. They understand that every share they purchase is another tiny claim on future corporate profits. But here's where most people derail their dividend strategy, and it's something I see constantly. They get impatient and start chasing yield without considering the bigger picture. Someone will show them a stock yielding 9% and suddenly their carefully constructed portfolio of 4% yielders seems inadequate. This yield-chasing mentality destroys more dividend portfolios than market crashes ever could. The reality is that sustainable dividend growth almost always trumps high current yield when you're building long-term income streams. A company paying 4% today that grows its dividend by 8% annually will be paying significantly more in absolute dollars within a decade than a company that starts at 7%, but grows its dividend by only 2% per year. Let me share a real example that illustrates this perfectly. Back in 2010, I had a client who was torn between two investments. Stock A yielded 7.2% at the time, while Stock B only yielded 3.8%. The high yield was obviously more attractive for immediate income needs, but Stock B had a 20-year track record of growing its dividend by an average of 12% annually. Fast forward to today, and Stock B is now yielding over 8% on the original investment due to consistent dividend growth, while Stock A actually cut its dividend twice and currently yields less than 5% on the original purchase price. The client who chose patience over immediate gratification is now earning significantly more income from the initially lower-yielding investment. This brings us to something I call dividend compound timing, which is probably the most underappreciated concept in income investing. Most people think compound interest only applies to reinvested gains, but dividend growth creates its own compounding effect that works independently of stock price appreciation. When you own shares in a company that consistently grows its dividend, you're essentially getting automatic raises on your investment without having to do anything. Your original capital keeps generating higher and higher income streams year after year, regardless of what happens to the stock price in the short term. Think about this mathematically for a moment. If you invest $100,000 in a stock yielding 4% that grows its dividend by 7% annually, your income from that investment doubles approximately every 10 years. So your $4,000 annual income becomes $8,000 in year 10, $16,000 in year 20, and $32,000 in year 30. The same initial capital is eventually generating 8 times more income than it did originally. This is why starting early with dividend investing provides such massive advantages. Time isn't just your friend for capital appreciation. Time is your friend for dividend compounding. Every extra year you give your dividend growth stocks to work is another year of automatic income increases that compound on top of previous increases. Now let's talk about something that could completely change your timeline for reaching $3,000 monthly. Dollar cost averaging into dividend stocks during market downturns can dramatically accelerate your progress toward income replacement goals. When stock prices fall, dividend yields automatically increase for new purchases, assuming the companies maintain their dividend payments. I learned this lesson during the 2008 financial crisis when I was still working on Wall Street. While everyone was panicking about portfolio values declining, I was quietly accumulating shares of quality dividend payers at yields that hadn't been available for decades. Companies that normally yielded 3% were suddenly available at 6% or 7% yields due to depressed stock prices. The key insight here is that market crashes create temporary opportunities to lock in higher yields on future income streams. If you can maintain your discipline and continue investing when everyone else is selling, you can dramatically improve the yield on cost for your entire portfolio. But there's a psychological challenge that comes with this strategy. It requires you to invest money when the financial news is terrifying and your portfolio statements look awful. Most people do exactly the opposite. They get excited and invest more when markets are hitting new highs, and they get scared and stop investing when markets crash. This emotional response is completely understandable but financially destructive. The best dividend yields are available when nobody wants to own stocks, not when everyone is optimistic about the future. Learning to invest counter-cyclically is one of the most valuable skills you can develop as a dividend investor. Here's something else that most people don't consider when planning their dividend strategy. The sequence of your investments matters enormously for building income streams. If you start with lower-yielding, higher-growth companies when you're young and gradually shift toward higher-yielding, more mature companies as you age, you can optimize both growth and income over your investing lifetime. This life cycle approach to dividend investing recognizes that your needs change over time. In your 20s and 30s, you can afford to prioritize dividend growth over current income because you're still earning salary income. But as you approach retirement or financial independence, current yield becomes increasingly important for meeting living expenses. The beautiful thing about dividend growth investing is that it naturally accommodates this transition. Those companies you bought for their growth potential when you were younger will likely be paying much higher yields on your original investment by the time you need the income. Meanwhile, you can add higher yielding positions to boost current income as your timeline shortens. Let me address something that causes a lot of confusion among new dividend investors. Dividend yield and dividend growth rate are often inversely related, meaning you typically can't have both high current yield and high growth rates in the same stock. Companies paying 6% or 7% dividends usually can't grow those payments as quickly as companies paying 2% or 3% dividends. This relationship exists because companies have finite resources. Money paid out as dividends can't simultaneously be reinvested for growth. So companies that retain more of their earnings typically grow faster, while companies that pay out more of their earnings provide higher current income but slower growth. Understanding this trade-off is crucial for building a dividend portfolio that matches your goals and timeline. If you need income immediately, you'll probably need to accept slower dividend growth. If you can wait for income to build over time, you can prioritize faster-growing companies with lower current yields. The portfolio construction implications of this trade-off are significant. A well-designed dividend portfolio should probably include companies across the entire spectrum from high growth, low yield to high yield, low growth. The exact mix depends on your current income needs and time horizon. Now here's where dividend investing gets really sophisticated, and this is something that separates amateur investors from professionals. Sector rotation within your dividend portfolio can help optimize both income and growth over different economic cycles. Different types of dividend-paying companies perform better in different economic environments. During economic expansions, cyclical dividend payers like banks, industrials, and materials companies often increase their dividends more aggressively. During recessions, defensive dividend payers like utilities, consumer staples, and healthcare companies provide more stability. By understanding these patterns, you can potentially enhance your portfolio's performance across different market conditions. But here's the critical point that I always emphasize with my mentoring clients. Don't let sector rotation become speculation. The goal isn't to time the market perfectly, but rather to maintain appropriate diversification across sectors and economic cycles. Dramatic portfolio changes based on economic predictions often do more harm than good. The tax implications of dividend investing deserve much more attention than most people give them. In taxable accounts, dividends are generally taxed as ordinary income or at capital gains rates depending on whether they're qualified dividends. This tax burden can significantly impact your net returns, especially if you're in higher tax brackets. This is where Roth IRAs become incredibly powerful for dividend investors. Since Roth contributions are made with after-tax dollars, all future dividends and growth are completely tax-free when withdrawn in retirement. For someone building a long-term dividend income stream, the tax savings can be enormous over decades of compounding. Consider this scenario. Two investors each contribute $6,000 annually to dividend-focused accounts for 20 years. One uses a taxable account, the other uses a Roth IRA. Assuming identical investments yielding 4% with 6% annual dividend growth, the Roth IRA investor could end up with hundreds of thousands more in spendable income over their lifetime due to tax advantages. But there's another tax strategy that sophisticated dividend investors use that most people never consider. Tax loss harvesting in taxable accounts can help offset the tax burden from dividend income. When you have unrealized losses in some positions, you can strategically realize those losses to offset current year dividend income. This strategy requires careful coordination between your dividend-focused holdings and other investments, but it can significantly improve your after-tax returns over time. The key is maintaining your overall asset allocation and dividend strategy while opportunistically harvesting losses for tax benefits. Look, building a $3,000 monthly dividend stream isn't some get-rich-quick scheme or financial fantasy. It's a mathematical reality that requires patience, discipline, and a willingness to think differently about money than most people ever will. We've covered the mechanics, from understanding that you need roughly $600,000 to $900,000 depending on your yield strategy, to the power of dividend growth compounding over decades. The real secret isn't complex financial engineering or access to exclusive investments. It's simply becoming the type of person who can delay gratification long enough to let compound dividend growth work its magic. Most people will never build substantial dividend income because they can't resist spending those quarterly payments instead of reinvesting them for years or decades. But if you can master that discipline, if you can focus on accumulating shares rather than chasing daily stock prices, you'll eventually reach that point where your money works harder than you ever did. That Sunday morning scenario I described at the beginning isn't just possible, it's inevitable for those who stay committed to the process. The choice is yours. You can keep trading your time for money until you're too old to enjoy the results, Or you can start building an income stream that grows whether you're awake or asleep. Either way, those quarterly dividend payments will keep arriving for someone. The question is whether they'll be arriving for you.